the end for the Q&A. Okay, so over to you, Adrienn. Thank you.
Thank you, Kath. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the 5th webinar this week about assessments. I'm going to try and share my screen. All right, so let me just make sure that I can also see the chat. It's great to see that we have so many people from so many different parts of the world. And thank you for joining. So today we're going to talk about assessment for learning in the primary classroom. And I'm going to get started by showing you something that you've probably seen before. So a pre-webinar survey was circulated where we've asked participants to respond to some questions about assessment. I'd like to thank everyone who has taken the time to actually fill this out, because it's been really informative to analyze the results. I'd like to share with you some of the key findings, because I found it really, really interesting. So over 34% of those who responded incorporate assessment for learning into their teaching once a week or more often, and 30% do it regularly, which means every day or every lesson, which is amazing. However, when participants were asked about AFL specific professional development, almost 70% of the respondents said that they have not received dedicated training, which is really interesting. And I think also makes it really, really great that we have access to these free webinars this week. Overall, the data from this pre-webinar survey suggests that there is positive perception amongst the participants regarding the integration of assessment for learning in their teaching, because around 80% agree, at least to some extent, with the statement that AFL is fully integrated in every lesson they teach. And almost half of these respondents think that it's relatively easy to do so. However, what's unclear is whether the respondents fully understand the concept of assessment for learning and what it means to fully integrate it into every lesson. And this is evidenced by some of the responses that I got to the statements about making effective use of the AFL data and regular use of peer and self-assessment. So all of this information that I gathered influenced the way that this webinar has been planned. So let's have a look at the structure. So the session is divided into 3 parts. First, we're going to look at assessment of learning versus assessment for learning. In part 2, we're going to talk about AFL in the primary classroom and why it's important for learners and teachers. And then in part 3, we're going to look at some practical ideas that I have tried and enjoyed, and so did my learners. All right. So this pre-webinar survey suggests that there is some variability in the respondents' level of confidence when it comes to the difference between assessment for learning and assessment of learning. These responses suggest that there may be some uncertainty regarding this. So I thought I'd like to invite you to a little game. I'm about to show you 2 pictures. And using the chat, I would like you to answer this question. Which picture do you think best represents assessment? So just assessment in general, right? So is it picture A or picture B? So which picture do you think best represents assessment? Please put your answers in the chat. Okay, thank you. Started getting the answers. That's great. Okay, I'm getting a lot of answers for B, although some people are saying A, and I can see both as well. Okay, some of you are even saying that A can be self-assessment. All right. Well, there is no right or wrong answer. All right. Assessment of learning is also known as assessment for summative purposes, as Annie and Claudia have told us. And it evaluates learners' progress up to that particular point when the assessment happens, and it provides a summary of where they are. Assessment of learning is seen, I guess, as a more traditional approach to assessment, and the aim is usually to collect data that can give information about attainment. So an example of this would be an exam at the end of a course, or a unit test, or a end of term assessment in a primary or secondary school setting. And these examples all share some features, namely that they usually result in a grade, and they report on success or failure. So maybe a better representation or closer representation of that would be picture A, although I agree with those of you who said that A could be self-assessment as well. As I said, there are no right or wrong answers here. Assessment for learning is also known as assessment for formative purposes. William defines assessment for learning as a teaching approach that generates feedback that students and teachers can use to improve their performance. For example, observing class discussion, or asking questions, or reviewing work in progress. So in that sense, maybe picture B is a better representation of that. Assessment for learning is usually immediate, and it gives students more control over their own learning. It is a process by which assessment information is used by the teachers to adjust their teaching strategies, but also by the students to adjust their learning strategies. Assessment for learning usually boosts motivation, and us as teachers, we can gain insight into students' level of understanding. While assessment of learning usually occurs at the end of the learning process, assessment for learning can happen at any stage, really. So let's move on to talk about assessment for learning in the primary classroom, because that's why we're here. We're going to start by looking at some key principles of assessment for learning. Let's see what these are. First one is encouraging learners to focus on their own progress. It's essential that learners don't compare themselves with each other. Their progress needs to be emphasized over their attainment. And this is especially important if they're very young, because they might not even have that much of an understanding of how attainment is measured. The second one is that we need to communicate confidence that every learner can improve. We can help learners believe that they can improve by giving specific feedback on what they need to do and how they can do it. Primary learners, in my experience, delight in doing well, and they try their hardest if they know how they can improve. The third one is empowering our learners to take an active part in their own learning. The assessment for learning process can help learners to become more aware of what they are learning, but also how they are learning it. And this is regardless of their age. This empowers them to take control of their own learning by developing their skills of self-regulation. And as they begin to assess their own work and set goals for themselves, they also become more independent. Number 4 is develop learners' confidence in peer and self-assessment. These are skills that learners need time and practice in. The more they do it, the more confident and the more accurate they will be in their assessment. And this is something that Vasiliki was talking about a lot as well during her webinar, that the more her students practiced, the better they became at peer and self-assessment. Number 5 is allowing for longer response time and asking follow-up questions. So the research has looked into how long teachers tend to wait after posing a question. Can you guess how long? I would like you to put your guesses into the chat for me. How long do you think we tend to wait after we ask a question? Okay, I can see that some of you are familiar with the research. Yes, thank you. Also, just want to give a quick heads up to the backstage team that there is a big storm going on outside, so I can't guarantee that my internet connection is going to last, but let's hope so. So thank you for all those answers. Yes, a lot of you are saying 3 seconds and 5 seconds. The last I read was 3 seconds, which is very, very short. Our learners need time to process the questions that we ask. And this is even more important to remember in verbal situations. They need time to process what they heard, yeah, and then to internally translate that maybe into their first languages, and then to gather their thoughts about the content, make decisions about how to express that in the target language, and all of that needs to happen before they utter a word. So 3 seconds seems really, really short for that. Now, once you get a response from them, though, you need to encourage them to extend those answers. So you need to start thinking about follow-up questions that are appropriate. All right. Principle number 6 is that you have to have some slack to do formative assessment. As Dylan Wiliam claims, some things need to stop, even if they're good things, so that better things that can happen in our classrooms. So there needs to be enough wiggle room for you inside your lesson plan, your curriculum, your syllabus, so that you can create space for appropriate formative assessment. You need to think carefully about what areas or topics you could maybe skip in order to allow for that time to be used for formative assessment. And last but not least, you need to focus on the relationship between what you did and what the learners learned, so that you can improve your own practice. Formative assessment or assessment for learning is important because we need to check if our learners have learned what we intended for them to learn, or did they learn something else? Because that's fine, but we need to know that. And once we have that information, we can make informed decisions about how to move on. Let's talk about the 5 underlying principles of assessment for learning as presented by William and Thompson. And they have created a very helpful table where the left-hand side column lists the 3 stakeholders, the teachers, the peers, and the learners. And the topmost row states the 3 key questions. Where is the learning going? Where is the learner? And how do we get to where we need to? Principle number 1 is clarifying, understanding, and sharing the learning intentions. And this relates to all 3 of the key stakeholders and answers the question, where is the learning going? So this relates to things like curriculum design, and in Rosenshine's principles of instruction, this would be about sequencing concepts, providing models, or appropriate scaffolding for our learners. Because both the learners and us, the teachers, need to know what excellence looks like. Principle number 2 relates to the teacher and answers the question, where is the learner? And this is engineering effective classroom discussions, tasks, and activities that elicit evidence of learning. So here we need to think about responsive teaching. Sorry, someone is asking about earlier slide. I'm so sorry, but I don't think I can go back at the moment, but we'll see if maybe we can share the slides, and there will be a handout as well. So principle number 2 is about responsive teaching. And this teaching needs to be highly interactive. The teacher needs to get feedback from the students about the learning, whether that's happening or what kind of learning is happening. So this can happen through good questioning routines and knowledge check routines. And again, when we think about Rosenshine's principles, this would be checking, understanding, and probing questions. And we need to keep a balance between diagnostic questions, but also all student response questions. Principle 3 relates to the teacher and answers the question how to get to where we need to. And it is about providing feedback that moves the learner forward, and forward is the operative word here, because feedback is only successful if the student's learning improves. Our goal is to change students' capacity to produce better work. So Rosenshine talks about moving forward from guided to independent practice. Teaching should be cyclical, and we have seen this in all the different webinars this week. It needs to be cyclical so that when the students receive the feedback from the teacher, they can go and have another go and improve their performance. Don't be misled by the word back in feedback, because good feedback avoids the should have, could have, would have narrative, and it tells the learners instead what they need to be able to do better the next time. So feedback needs to be forward-looking. That's what we need to remember. I'm so sorry. I wasn't meant to change the slide. I'm sorry. So let's now have a look at the last two strategies that relate to the learner and peers. Here, we need to think about how the learners can be active participants in the classroom and beyond. Because let's face it, teachers work hard. It's definitely the hardest job I've ever had. But learners need to be working even harder than us. So looking at peers, the principle is that we need to activate students' learning resources for one another. So think about all those routines you have in the classroom, grouping your students in pairs, in groups, doing think, pair, share, or structured dialogues. Those are all good ways of making sure that they can support each other. For the learner, it's about activating the student as owner of their own learning, so putting them in charge. They need to set learning goals, and we need to make sure that they form effective schemata. We need to give students access to our long-term plans. So that's something to think about, and how best we can do that, depending on their age as well. We also need to set up milestones that are achievable for them. We need to make sure that there is clear rationale and rational models that they can look at. And we need to make sure that we provide exemplars of performance at different levels of success. This is something that we'll look at a little bit later as well. So now we're moving on to the third part of the webinar, where we're going to look at some practical ideas for assessment for learning with primary learners. Can I just ask, do you actively teach your primary learners reflection skills? Please respond in the chat with a yes or a no. So reflection skills, is that something that you teach? Okay, a lot of you do, which is great. Yeah, I can see some no's as well, which is how, you know, I have to be honest with you, a couple of years ago, I didn't think that it needed to be a part of an ESL lesson. But I'm going to tell you why I think it should actually be. To me, assessment for learning is the backbone of teaching, because it provides me as the teacher with valuable information about what the students know and what they can do independently and what they maybe need a little bit more help with. But assessment for learning also helps the learners figure out how they can get better. It involves a lot of reflection, though, both on the part of our learners and on our part as well. So that is why I think it's actually important that we teach these skills. Sometimes reflecting individually does the trick, but at other times we need our peers to point out how we could do better. And that goes both for us as teachers and for our learners as well. So the following practical ideas are all related to the 5 underlying principles that I presented earlier. Let's get started with the first one. Learning intentions. William argues that it's essential for teachers to be absolutely clear about what it is they want their students to learn. Yogi Berra, I don't know if you're familiar, but he once said, if you don't know where you're going, you might end up someplace else. So again, a question to you. Do you share the learning objectives with your learners? And if you do, when in your lesson do you do that? Can you please put your answers in the chat? Okay. Thank you. So lots of yeses. Yeah. Briefly at the beginning, in the beginning, mostly in the beginning. Okay. At the beginning and the end of the lesson. Okay, that's interesting. Start of a unit. All right. Okay. Third part of a lesson flow. Okay, there's quite a range there. But most people, I think, share it at the beginning of the lesson. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you for all the responses. So I think we can all agree that learning intentions and having clear learning intentions in a child-friendly language and sharing that with our learners is very, very important. And it relates to the two underlying principles that you can see on the screen. So from our perspective as teachers, we clarify and make sure that our students understand these learning intentions when we share it with them. And it also helps us activate the learners as owners of their own learning. But here is the caveat. By stating these learning objectives on the board and getting learners to copy them at the beginning of every lesson might just take the fun out of the entire lesson. And don't get me wrong, I've done this for many years. In fact, I worked in schools where you know, the institution itself insisted on these being stated on the board by the time the students walk through the door. But I think it's best to be left up to the teacher to decide when and how it's best to reveal the learning intentions in a lesson. So now let's have a look at some variations that I think are a bit more motivating for primary learners. You could consider setting up an appropriate lead-in activity first, and then elicit the learning objective from your learners. So for instance, if the learning objective is to discuss their last holidays with their families, then maybe you can start the lesson by showing photos of your holiday first, letting them guess where you went and what you did, and then answer any questions that they may have, and then ask them, so what do you think we're going to learn about today? I think they're probably going to be really involved by this point, and they will want to actually tell you what they're going to be learning about. Or you could give them a gapped version of the learning objective early on in a lesson. And this can be right at the very beginning or after the lead-in, it's up to you, but keep it towards the beginning of the lesson. And then tell the learners that you will want them to be able to complete the gaps by the end of the lesson. So this way you can easily tie the different lesson stages together, both for yourself and for your learners. And you can use it as a reflection task or an exit ticket, like Annie was talking about, at the end of the session, right? This way the learners are bound to be more motivated to stay on track during the lesson, and they will want to crack that puzzle, and they will be so motivated to show you that they could. Let's move on to talking about questions. So targeted questioning relates to how we can engineer these effective classroom discussions and tasks and activities. And they help us make sure that we get evidence of the learning happening. I think one of the easiest ways actually to implement assessment for learning in any lesson is utilizing questions. But asking the right kind of questions is key. And there are a few things that we need to be aware of. For instance, as we talked about before, we need to give ample time for our learners to process the questions that they heard, to think about their response, and then to process the language as well that they need to respond before expecting them to say anything. So for instance, if they're very young or if their level is really low, then I like to actually give them time to maybe take some notes of what they want to say in any language they want before they try and respond, even if it's a verbal kind of activity. You also need to get comfortable with silence, because if you wait longer than what we tend to, then there will be quite a lot of silence, but silence doesn't mean that learning isn't happening. Silence just creates space for that learning to actually be happening in the classroom. You also need to ask concept checking questions to find out whether your learners understand the topic at hand. So think CCQs that you can plan before the lesson, or you can make them up on the fly during the lesson as well. It's also good to use might to elicit how to get to that next stage. So instead of maybe asking a question of, oh, here, how can you correct that mistake? Maybe you could ask, oh, how might you correct that mistake? You're giving your student more credit that they will be able to, and that it's not a test of their abilities. So start using might more. What might you do next? Or what might you need to succeed here? Yeah, just rephrase those questions a little bit. Use the magic word. Why? I mean, why is such a versatile word in the repertoire of a teacher, I think. You can encourage your learners to extend their answers by just simply asking them why they think what they just said. And it works like magic, at least in my classroom. I think a lot of you can probably relate to this, but I really used to struggle with, coming back to class after a weekend, students being away and circle time. And I asked them, so what did you do at the weekend? And they say nothing. And I'm sure that's not true, but they maybe felt put on the spot, or they just didn't think that they did anything so exciting. And then, communication breakdown, there it is. I asked a question, the answer was nothing, and I couldn't think of an appropriate follow-up question. So I started asking why. And the students were really surprised at first. But you know what? I started getting more extended answers. And to be fair, I think some of them started giving me more extended answers just so that I wouldn't ask them why. But it works either way. And I did actually end up learning a lot more about my students during circle time than I did before. So yeah, why works. Just keep with it. But try not to put your learners on the spot. Don't target your learners individually unless you're 100% certain that they will be able to give you an answer, especially if this is at the end of an activity. But instead, you could ask them to write their responses on a whiteboard or a piece of paper or in a notebook and hold it up so that you can see everybody's answers. And that way, you're not putting anybody on the spot, but you can see exactly how your students are feeling and what they maybe need help with. So after questions, which are essential tools for any teacher, let's talk about statements now. Because sometimes statements are better to generate effective classroom discussions that allow you to elicit that evidence of learning. So look at the image and look at it as an example of a statement. So imagine that you're working on the topic of travel, and you could by all means introduce the topic by asking them about their travel experiences, or show them some pictures of your own, or ask them to draw their last holiday. There are many different ways to introduce that topic. And you will probably end up with some discussion and some answers. But the learners are most probably working in the lower two tiers of Bloom's taxonomy, remembering and understanding, which is not necessarily a problem. Okay, so depending on age and ability, that might be all you want for that particular session. But you could start the same lesson by showing them a statement like the one that you can see, and when you do that, you are promoting your learners to think a little bit more deeply about the topic. They are more likely to give you more extended and deeper answers that show more evidence of the learning, because they are more likely to be actually applying, analyzing, and evaluating that statement. A caveat here, I think this works much better with upper primary students. Key stage 2 students tend to respond to this much better, although there might be exceptions, and maybe some key stage 1 classes can do this as well. So yeah, do give statements a try. Okay, traffic lights. Traffic lights are one of my all-time favorite activities, and I've been using this for at least 15 years. And I started using it way before I realized what a useful assessment for learning tool it is. Super simple. Get learners to make a set of colored cards, or you can make them yourself, in the fashion of traffic lights. And teach your learners that green stands for, I'm feeling confident about the task. Yellow means they might have questions, or that there are parts that they can do independently. And red means that they need immediate support because they don't know what to do, or they don't know how to do it. And this is going to make sure that they are owners of their own learning, but also that you get feedback from them. So you could have these cards and then hand them out in every lesson. Or what I like to do is keep them in a particular place in my classroom where my students know how to get to them, and then use them frequently. You do not have to wait till the end of the lesson to ask for feedback. You can ask them to show you a card to indicate how much they think they already know about the topic that you're about to start. Or you could ask them to show you how they are progressing halfway through a lesson or halfway through an activity even. And the beauty of this strategy is that you can get immediate feedback and you can course correct accordingly. So if you see a lot of red, you go and help right away. And there are some yellow cards in the corner. Then you go and offer some support, some guiding questions, targeted questioning. But if you see a lot of green, and first of all, you're going to give yourself a little pat on the back because you are doing great. It's also good because it doesn't require much or any language on the part of the learners. So even learners with very, very little English, or learners who are really young, will be able to participate because the concept is just so universal. And I've used this strategy successfully with early years, primary, secondary, even with adults, and so far everyone loved it. Well, I want to ask you again, if you were using the traffic light system in your classroom, what else do you think the 3 colors could stand for? Because it is entirely up to you. I'm only giving you an idea that I often end up using, but can you put your ideas in the chat? What do you think red, green, and yellow could stand for that would give you useful information? Easy, mediocre, difficult. Okay, so you could get easy, very good. That's a great idea, actually, to get feedback about the task itself. Speaking in turns, minus, plus, interesting, feelings. Oh, stop, ready, go. That's actually, yeah, that's great for some great kinesthetic activities as well. Okay, so you could, yeah, there is a suggestion for how you could use it, maybe for like classroom management as well. Discipline, yeah. Green can be start working, okay. Take a pose maybe, and then red would be to stop. Oh, great. Yes, you can use it to indicate how much time they think they need until they can finish the activity. Great, thank you. Now, at this point, if you're looking at my slides, you might be wondering how this activity activates students as learning resources for one another. Well, here's how. There are way too many learners for you to be able to support everyone individually, especially if you work in a country like Malaysia, where I am, where you have 40+ students in your class. But based on the colors that you see in your classroom, you can rearrange the groups that you have, and then you allow for peer support. So maybe you go and help those who are showing you red cards, you group them all together and you go and help there, and then you rearrange the greens to help the yellows or something like that. Or if you have a teaching assistant, you can have a system set up where in one of my past schools, I had a great teaching assistant, and our go-to method was that I would be working with the greens and the reds, and she would be supporting the yellows. And sometimes we deviated, but that's generally how we did things. So gestures and emojis are another alternative to the traffic lights idea. You ask your learners to use hand gestures or smiley faces. For instance, they can show you a thumbs up if they are confident, and thumbs down if they aren't. Or they can use their mini whiteboards or piece of paper to draw smiley faces, or to show their level of confidence with the task, or even to clap once, twice, and 3 times to give you feedback. So those of you who are raising little ones of your own, you're probably already using these activities to get some feedback from children before they are able to talk to you. So this is great because it doesn't require language. And most kids love kinesthetic activities. My daughter is currently 5, but when she was little, she already knew what thumbs up meant before she was able to say the words thumbs up. And not to mention that emojis are a universal language, which help us express a range of ideas. As an EAL teacher, I work with new arrivals who often speak next to no English. And I use emojis extensively to communicate with these students because I don't tend to speak their first languages. So yeah, emojis, great. Can-do statements. Using can-do statements is a great way of getting learners to assess themselves. Lots of modern course books use this strategy as well. And they usually have them at the end of the unit as reflection. The learners get the chance to evaluate their own learning. And they are a great way of making the learning visible and to bridge the lesson aim, the learning intention, right, to the outcomes from the lesson, from the unit, from the course. We just need to make sure that the statements are written in a child-friendly language. So here is an example. If the learning objective is that by the end of the lesson, learners will be able to use the present simple to talk about their daily routines, well, that's written for the teacher, maybe for SLT, definitely not for the learner. But maybe you could have this on the board. I can use the present simple verbs to make sentences about my daily routine. That's perfectly child-friendly. It's short enough and specific enough for them to actually achieve in one lesson. Just a bit conscious of time, but yeah, I have a couple of more minutes. I have so much to say. Mistakes. Well, my students are always surprised when I tell them that I absolutely love mistakes. I guess they must think that teachers aren't supposed to say that, much less feel that, because mistakes are supposed to be kept a secret, right? They should be hidden. They're not supposed to be acknowledged, much less loved. But I strongly believe that mistakes are great. They're great because we can learn from them. When a learner makes a mistake, I'm delighted because first of all, I know that they're learning. And also because I get to learn more about the way that they are thinking. So in my experience, eliciting reasons for incorrect answers, but also for correct ones, especially before you reveal that correct answer, it often leads to highly useful conversations that tell me a lot about where things might have gone wrong and what needs to be clarified. And then I can make decisions about whether I take that up in a following lesson or whether I deviate from the lesson plan and do something else instead in this particular lesson. Is this an immediate need that needs to be fixed? Students also learn that mistakes are part and parcel of the learning process and not something that they need to be ashamed of or avoid at all costs. And I think you'll find that this builds up motivation, confidence, and also helps the rapport with your students in the classroom. Success criteria again, it's something that we heard a lot about this week. It's important to know what is expected of us if we want to succeed, and it's no different for our learners. So assessment criteria, rubrics, and checklists can provide learners with information, and they can be referred to during and after the task as well. With older learners, I like to get them involved in making the assessment criteria that will be used. So remember assessing a cookie, like how we were involved with Claudia. You could do the same with maybe Key Stage 2 students, upper primary students. And this way you can make sure that they fully understand what is expected of them and that they get the chance to engage with the expectations before they have to do the task. And then after they do the task, I ask them to assess each other as peer assessment using that set of criteria. And then when I give them feedback on their final draft, I use the same criteria as well. Now, an added advantage of these is that they can be as detailed as you want them to be. The professional ones, like think language exam ones, are quite complex. And if you have to use them, then you might have to think about how you grade the language. But it's important that we train our learners in how they can deduce information from this kind of rubric, really. Another pro is that it can be highly visual. So what I tend to do is that when I mark their final draft, I highlight the relevant parts of the assessment criteria. And I also add my personalized comments. So when my learners get the feedback back, they get their writing back with my maybe margin notes or personalized comments, and I attach a copy of the success criteria, and they can see where they are because I highlighted it, and they will see what they need to do to be able to get to where they want to be. Not to mention it cuts down on marking time. Comment-only marking is a big thing in primary, I feel, because grades and points can be really scary. And I feel like the learners and the parents tend to put too much emphasis on this measure of performance, especially since they live in Asia. And I think the problem, other than the pressure that it puts on the learner, is that the learners don't seem to be able to see past that particular number or letter anymore. And so whatever feedback I give is not necessarily as useful as it could be. So sticking to comments only and avoiding grades if possible helps the learners focus on how to get better, because it encourages them to engage with the feedback and make corrections to get better. Even when I was teaching in a secondary school, I would often return assessments, even the summative assessments, without a grade at first. And I would ask my students to take a different color pen and make their corrections, resubmit, and only then would they get their final grade. If it was a unit test or a test that wasn't an end of term assessment, then I often took their corrections into consideration as well before I decided on the grade. The important thing here is communicate it clearly to them what that correction that they make is going to do for them. But I do feel that this way my students were forced to focus on the feedback over the grade. And we need to remember that feedback needs to be forward-looking. So we need to make sure that we keep a balance when we give feedback, right? So we need to make sure that our learners have a few areas that they can focus on and repeat that task. So for instance, you know, they write a postcard, you have that criteria that you agreed on with your students, they do peer assessment, then you assess them, you give them feedback, and then you let them repeat that task, maybe as homework, or maybe in a following session, you turn the task around slightly so that they're not repeating the same task, but that they can put the feedback that you spend time on to good use. This is the last one. Again, I'm just conscious of time, but so 2 stars in the wish is a great peer assessment activity that encourages the learners to look at someone else's work and find positives as well as to give constructive criticism. because we all tend to find mistakes in each other's work much more easily than we do in our own. So that one wish part, they don't struggle with that much, although you might have to help them a little bit with how to phrase that. But they might need a little bit of nudging to find positives. And so one of the things that you can do is eliciting a few areas to comment on before they do the actual activity. So you could show them examples like, oh, you've started every sentence with a capital letter, well done. Or you wrote a whole postcard in the past, that's amazing. And then I wish you wrote a bit more about why you like the beach so much, is what they need to improve on. Okay. So thank you so much. This brings me to the end of my presentation. I think this further reading is going to be shared with you in the email. And of course, there is a handout as well. And thank you so much for listening to me. And thank you for being active participants in the chat. You can find me on social media. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me with my name. And of course, you can email me or find me through my blog, ealdiaries.com. And I'm going to pass the mic back to Kath. Now I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Adrienn. That was fantastic. Loads of ideas there. I know you were a bit short for time, but we've got some questions.
I'm so sorry.
Well. No, don't worry. We've got lots of questions as well, so maybe we've got time just to answer a few of those. But yeah, it was really interesting ideas. So we've got a few questions. One is about, we're just talking what you were just talking about withholding grades and giving comments so that students focus a little bit more on feedback. I think that's a great idea. And we've got a question here from Chris, who's saying, you can withhold grades until students have resubmitted their written work. Is there any way you could do something similar with speaking tasks where you wouldn't?
I think yeah, absolutely. Because you could always ask them to do the speaking task again, right? So same idea applies that you could by all means ask them to repeat the same exact activity as like a rehearsal and then a final performance. Or, you know, all those activities that we do in the EFA classroom, like the onion discussion, the leather discussion, where they're basically, you know, they're changing partners, but still talking essentially about the same topic. So maybe doing it like that, and then only telling them that, okay, you're going to do this maybe 3 times. And you're going to get feedback after the first 2, and it's only the 3rd time when you're going to get your grade.
Yeah, great.
Or maybe getting them to record the final one so that you actually can take that away and spend some time with it so that you can give them some, or maybe the second one would be a better one to record it so that you can give them some substantial feedback before the final performance.
Yeah, that's a great idea. We've got another question from somebody called Ulita, who's saying, how would you validate learners' self-assessment and peer assessment? So if they're new to this, if they've never done it before, is there any technique or strategy that you can suggest?
Not a particular strategy, but it does take time. So when Vicky was talking about the writing portfolio as well, right? She told us that it did take time for her students to actually be perceptive and also to know how to do it. So it's not going to happen overnight, especially if your learners are quite young. But I do feel like it's worth spending the time on you planning it and then putting it in practice. And I think it's really important that you stick with it. So if your learners know that this is something that will keep coming up in the lesson, like say 2 stars in the wish is something that keeps coming up in every single lesson or every other lesson, they will get used to it. And you will see that the time you have to dedicate to that particular stage of your lesson is going to shorten over time, I think. Yeah. But quality, I think when you're monitoring, you could be giving suggestions to your students, you know, just being really appreciative of whatever feedback they are giving, and then maybe just nudging them a little bit to extend it. Again, the why works quite well. Why you think so, tell your partner why you think so. Or if you feel like they are very young or at the very, very beginning of this journey, then maybe a checklist type of self and peer assessment works better.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, another question related to that a little bit is Serena's saying that these are all excellent tips, but how can we implement them among very early primary students with very little English, especially in contexts where maybe L1 is strongly discouraged? I know you talked about giving students time to write in their own language or in L1. In some contexts, this is not, it's not really clean. How would you, any suggestions for how to deal with that?
So this webinar, right, I didn't specify ages because so many people are attending from I try to make it fit as many different contexts as possible, but of course there is no one size fits all, and I'm aware of that. I think some of these strategies definitely work better with younger students and some don't work that well. Like success criteria is quite a difficult concept for young children. But 2 stars in the wish can actually work with very young learners if you do it verbally. And the other thing that I've done that my students really liked is got those differently shaped post-its. And so they had a star and a heart. And so the star was the wishing star and the heart was something they liked. And then those who could write maybe wrote a word on it, and those who couldn't then maybe just drew something, and it wasn't necessarily related to, but it was, everyone got feedback this way because everybody was putting their stars and hearts everywhere, and then they verbally tried to share what they liked about each other's work.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Yeah. I mean, I think the traffic lights as well would work.
Yes, the traffic lights definitely works. In fact, that's actually an activity that that I observed in an early years classroom that had nothing to do with English. It was just and I was so delighted. So I was like, oh wow, I've been doing this for so many years, and the kids loved it. And the smiley faces and the gestures. As I said, when my daughter was a toddler, she was already able to use some of the gestures and smiley faces. You don't need language for that, so I would definitely leverage those.
Yeah, great. Just one other question, I guess, as well, is in some context, you talked about, people being very focused on grades, both parents and students. Have you ever had to sort of deal with a situation where, people are very insistent on having a grade?
Yes, yes, I did. My previous role, I was head of EAL in an international school just outside of Kuala Lumpur, and I had a policy in place in the school where EAL students weren't given grades in their first term. Not for everything, it depended on age, but in general for English, they wouldn't be graded. They were assessed. Yeah. They were assessed in, in all sorts of different ways that we could, but you weren't given grades. And it was very, very hard to have those initial conversations with parents because it was just such a foreign concept for them. And obviously, if their children were older, maybe secondary students, then the pressure of exams comes in. But also in that particular school, our year 6 primary students were taking checkpoint, and so there was a lot of pushback. Yeah. And it wasn't always an easy conversation. And I wouldn't claim that I changed everybody's minds about it. But it was also quite interesting to learn that the reason, when I tried to ask parents for the reason why they insisted on getting a grade, sort of like the answers were as varied, like everyone had a different reason. And it was often we took it case by case, and that was sort of like a better way of dealing with it. Sure. But I think it's also you need your institution behind you to be able to do that. Like if you do work in a place where you are required to give grades, it's definitely a bigger conversation to have with your SLT, with with your line manager maybe, and maybe start small. So see what you're in control of. And don't withhold grades on big tests until there is a time when you can.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'm sure we could talk for a lot longer about this topic. So thanks very much for the session, Adrienn. It was really interesting and loads of great practical ideas. So that's fantastic. Thank you very much. And thanks very much to everyone for participating and coming to all the events this week, all the webinars. And thanks to the Facebook team and Paul and Sally and Melissa for organising and hosting and moderating the events. So thanks very much, and have a nice weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you. All right. Thanks very much.